Chapter 5. Motors overtake horses and rail. Inventions and incremental improvements. My heart was pounding. I turned the crank. The engine started to go put-put-put, and the music of the future sounded with regular rhythm. We listened to it run for a full hour, fascinated, never tiring of the single tone of its song. The longer it played its note, the more sorrow and anxiety it conjured away from the heart. Carl Benz, 1879, as quoted by Smill, 2005, page 99. Introduction. Transportation takes giant strides forward. Since the beginning of human history, the speed of travel had been limited by hoof and sail. From the 1820s, steam power ended this tyranny of slowness, as the rapid development of railroads and steamship travel made the world smaller, and by reducing transport costs, created an upsurge in long, stagnant economic growth, as well as new forms of commerce and communication. By our starting date of 1870, the United States had built a 60,000-mile network of rail transport and was connected by steamships to every continent. The completion of the Transcontinental Railway with the Golden Spike Ceremony at Promontory Summit, Utah on May 10, 1869, was heralded in Chapter 2 as creating a dividing line in the history of American living standards. The treatment of transportation in this chapter further develops the main themes of the book. The great inventions of the late 19th century created an utter transformation in both the rural and urban standard of living that could happen only once, though the transition after each of the great inventions was not instantaneous, but rather spread out over many years. As demonstrated in Chapter 4, the role of electricity, running water, sewer pipes, and central heating in bringing the modern conveniences to American dwelling units required the 5 decades from 1880 to 1930 to transform urban life, whereas most of the parallel conversion in rural American farm and non-farm households still had not occurred by 1940 and awaited post-war peacetime prosperity. The transition to higher speed, flexibility, and comfort in transportation was both slower and faster than that of the home conveniences. Just as Chapter 4 treated multiple dimensions in housing across rural farm, rural non-farm, urban, regional, and social class differences, so this chapter distinguishes separate dimensions of the transportation revolution. Inner-city long-distance travel evolved slowly and was dominated by the steam railroad throughout 1870 to 1940. Whereas intracity transport experienced a steady and relatively rapid transformation from horse omnibuses in the 1850s and 1860s through horse-drawn streetcars, cable cars, electrified streetcars, and rapid transit, taking the form of both elevated and subway structures. By 1904, the electrified express trains of the New York City subway were traveling at 40 miles per hour, more than 10 times more quickly than the 3 miles per hour of the horse omnibuses only 4 decades earlier. But nothing in the millennia of human history, at least until the 1950 to 55 spread of television sets into the American home, rivals the speed with which automobile ownership spread in a mere 2 decades between 1910 and 1930 to the majority of American households. The invention and diffusion of the internal combustion engine utterly transformed the streets of the American city and town in those 20 years from rutted and pitted quagmires of mud, clogged with animal waste, to paved roads along which motor vehicles cruised just as they do today. And the transformation of urban streets is matched by the profound significance of the motor vehicle for the 30% of Americans who lived on farms in 1910. Though home-oriented modern conveniences were adapted much more rapidly in urban than in rural America, the automobile was accepted on the farm with unqualified enthusiasm even more rapidly than in the cities. This chapter provides not just a chronicle of the measures of performance by which each new invention surpassed its predecessor, but also a tale of continuous incremental improvement of each new mode of transportation after its initial commercial introduction. Layer by layer, the comfort, speed, and safety of the passenger train ride in the 1930s was improved multifold from what superficially might seem to be the same mode of transportation in 1870. Layer by layer, the power, comfort, convenience, and speed of the automobile were improved multifold from its initial introduction in 1900 to its near final form 4 decades later. Surface street public transport increased in speed and comfort layer by layer through successive improvements, particularly between 1860 and 1900. Each invention could happen only once, but the full working out of all the incremental improvements of these inventions required decades. Starting in the 1840s and 1850s, the steam railroad made the stagecoach, canal boat, and paddle-wheel river steamboat obsolete almost as quickly as the rails were laid. But except for commuter lines to suburban enclaves for the relatively rich, steam railroads never penetrated the internal passenger transportation needs of the city or solved the farmer's problem of transportation between the farm and the nearest train depot. Instead, urban and rural America before 1900 were subject to the tyranny of the horse. The horse was not only inefficient, eating up 1/4 of the nation's grain output, but also a source of urban pollution, disease, and occupational misery for the workers unlucky enough to have jobs in horse waste removal. 2 transportation revolutions happened almost simultaneously. The urban public transportation transition began within a decade of Edison's epical commercialization of the electric power generating station and distribution network. The transition from horse-drawn streetcars to electrified streetcars was fully complete in the United States between 1890 and 1902. New York's steam-powered elevated trains extended the length of Manhattan by 1880. Chicago's electrified elevated train structures were largely complete by 1897, and the first line in New York's far-flung electrified subway system opened in 1904. The second and simultaneous motor vehicle revolution began with the invention in Germany of a workable internal combustion engine in 1879, a mere 10 weeks after Edison's successful electric light experiment. Initially attached to carriage-like vehicles, the internal combustion engine's promise for motor transportation required another decade in which to develop reliable mechanisms to transfer engine power through a transmission device to the wheels. In 1900, there were only 8,000 motor cars registered in the United States, but the number skyrocketed to 468,000 in 1910, 9 million in 1920, and 23 million in 1929. Most astonishing, the total power created by automobiles exceeded that of all farm animals as early as 1910. A basic difference between the railroad and motor vehicle, viewed as fundamental inventions in the history of transportation, is that the railroad did not replace the horse, but rather raised the demand for horses by extending civilization into hitherto unreachable parts of the country, whereas the motor vehicle directly replaced the horse and led to its disappearance as a prime mover. This chapter views the transportation revolution of 1870 to 1940 from the point of view of consumer welfare, focusing on how the invention and development of new forms of transportation altered the nature of cities, the pattern of residential development, the relationship between the farm and the small town, and made possible new forms of work and recreation, while greatly reducing rural isolation. These changes resulted from not just the initial effects of each invention, but also the ensuing dramatic improvements in speed and other quality attributes in subsequent decades. The speed of intercity railroad travel almost tripled between 1870 and 1940. Whereas the development of a nationwide network of paved roads likewise increased the speed of automobile travel by a factor of at least 5 between 1905 and 1929. The chapter is organized in terms of the chronological order of the invention, starting with the interurban railroads that were already substantially developed by 1870, followed by the role of horses in both the urban and rural economies. We document the transition from horse-drawn omnibuses and streetcars to electrified streetcars and rapid transit. Our treatment of the automobile, truck, and bus revolutions includes technological developments and quality changes that mattered to consumers, including complementary inventions such as highways, suburbs, supermarkets, and leisure travel, each of which shifted the demand curve for motor vehicles to the right, and thus raised the consumer surplus associated with the initial invention. To limit the scope and length of the chapter, no attention is devoted to transatlantic steamships. Riverboats and canal boats are also excluded, for they were largely obsolete for passenger travel by our starting date of 1870. Air travel had only begun in our terminal year of 1940, so the treatment of the evolution of airline passenger travel is reserved for Chapter 11 in Part 2 of the book. The Interurban Steam Railroad, initial prime mover of economic development. The American railroad network expanded so rapidly from 1840 to 1900 that any description of railroad travel or the benefits of railroads must specify exactly which year is being discussed. A map of railroad tracks for 1861 displays dense coverage of the Union States between Maine and Wisconsin, at least 3 mainline routes between New York and Chicago, but only a tentative entry into eastern Iowa and Missouri, and nothing west of that. Railroad tracks were also sparse in the Confederate States. Perhaps Abraham Lincoln lacked knowledge of direct service between Chicago and New York when he traveled to give his epical Cooper's Union speech in New York City on February 27, 1860. He traveled by a circuitous route from Springfield, Illinois by way of Fort Wayne, Pittsburgh, and other intermediate stops. In contrast to the 825 miles between the two cities as the crow flies, Lincoln's journey extended over 1,200 miles and required 5 trains, 2 ferries, 4 days, 3 nights, and endless delays. As a further example, train travel from Washington to New York in 1860 was not just a train trip, but also a horse trip, requiring 4 separate train rides, 3 ferry rides, and 7 separate horse rides between the trains and ferries. The 31,000 miles of railroad completed in 1860 were not well connected, particularly because the gauge, width between the 2 rails of the track, was different in the South, in the North, and in Canada. The nationwide adoption of standard gauge facilitated interline transfers of equipment that allowed passengers the convenience of traveling longer distances without the need to remove their luggage from trains or to wait for connecting trains on platforms or in drafty train stations. Even before gauge was standardized, the railroad network expanded rapidly. Railroad mileage is displayed in Figure 5.1. Though few railroads were built during the Civil War, total mileage increased by a factor of 5 between 1870 and 1900. Nearly 20 new miles of track a day, on average, were built for 30 years. In contrast to the single transcontinental line from Omaha to Sacramento linked together in the historic 1869 ceremony, by 1893 there were 7 transcontinental lines, of which 3 were relatively close together, traversing Kansas and Nebraska, and 2 were quite close together in their paths through the sparsely populated Dakotas and Montana. The building of the transcontinental railroads is a tale of ambitious entrepreneurs, leverage and shady finance, and repeated business failures that twice contributed to financial panics that dragged the nation's economy into major depressions. A common theme in commentaries on the late 19th century railroad industry is overbuilding. And indeed, by 1900 there were no less than 6 different railroad lines available to transport passengers from Chicago to Minneapolis or Omaha. Data on passenger miles of railroad traffic are shown in Figure 5.2. Accepting the extraordinary peak of traffic in World War II, the busiest decade for passenger traffic was 1911 to 20, whose average annual traffic of 38.1 billion passenger miles is dwarfed by the U.S. airline industry's 850 billion passenger miles in 2014. Thus, the average person in the 1911 to 20 decade traveled only 379 miles by rail, whereas the average person in 2010 traveled 2,571 miles by air. After fluctuations caused by the Great Depression and World War II, rail passenger traffic per person experienced a steady decline in the post-war years, and by 1958 had declined below the level of 1882. The expansion of railroads in the central states in the 1850s and 1860s brought many benefits besides the sheer speed of the railroad when compared to horse or water transport. The railroad routes were not constrained by the pre-existing locations of rivers, but could be built in straight paths from city to city. The previous regime of canal and riverboat traffic always required horse-drawn transport to reach the final destination, so the railroad eliminated the mud bogs that afflicted horse-drawn travel in the rainy seasons. Most important was the elimination of winter's effects in suspending commerce from December to April as the Midwestern rivers froze from St. Louis north, making the vast river network inaccessible to shipping commerce for those 5 months each year. Abraham Lincoln was several years late in appreciating the introduction of rapid rail service between New York and Chicago, for 1852 marked the first year when travel from New York to Chicago was reduced from 2 weeks to less than 2 days. However, the benefits of train travel went far beyond speed. Reliability was also a novelty. For previous travel modes, including canal and river transportation and horse-drawn coaches, could be delayed for hours or even days by weather, accidents, or other hazards. Not only did railroads change by an order of magnitude the speed of surface travel, but the ability to harness hundreds of horsepower in a single locomotive meant that much heavier loads in long trains could be transported, greatly reducing the cost of transport of both passengers and freight, all the more so when the value of time saving was taken into account. William Cronin provides a classic contrast of the life of an Iowa merchant named Burroughs before and after the arrival of the Chicago and Rock Island Line at the Mississippi River in 1854. His pre-railroad business combined retail and wholesale trade in groceries, dry goods, and hardware, purchasing raw farm products directly from farmers, including sacks of grain, preserved meat, and a variety of fresh vegetables. Everything he bought or sold was received or shipped by riverboat, but this could happen only for 6 or 7 months per year, because the rivers froze for the rest of each year. Most of his time was spent trying to obtain information on the potential availability of buyers up and down the river, but news could travel only at the speed of a steamboat or horse. The establishment of the first railroad between Chicago and Iowa in 1854 did not mean effortless connections to the East Coast and New York. Only in 1870 did Commodore Vanderbilt, through agreements with other railroads that he did not own, establish the first through-train service between New York City and Chicago. By the early 1870s, the railroad and telegraph had utterly changed the life of burros and merchants everywhere. News arrived hourly by telegraph and daily by railroad. Gone were the high costs not just of transport, but also of all the credit that had to be granted during the frozen 6 months, when farm products could not be exported or finished goods imported from the East. In fact, Burroughs's business ultimately failed when his role of well-capitalized merchant, charging high markups for credit, risk, and inventory storage gave way to the easier post-railroad conditions that allowed the entry of many merchants who did not require large amounts of capital and who could charge lower prices. The arrival of the railroad and its elimination of seasonal travel restrictions was a gradual process. By subsequent standards, the technology of the first transcontinental railroad joining the Central Pacific from Sacramento to Utah and the Union Pacific from Utah to Omaha, was primitive. The early locomotives could barely pull loads on the steep tracks that climbed over the Sierra Nevada of California, and winter snow and ice both there and on the Great Plains shut down the transcontinental route entirely for a month or more in the early years of the 1870s. As seen by the average household, the railroad had profound effects both on the farm and in the cities. Even before the Civil War, benefits for city dwellers began to appear, being able to travel to cities several hundred miles away to explore business opportunities, to consider moving, or to visit friends and relatives. As the 1860 Abraham Lincoln story indicates, railroads were often short-haul routes between nearby cities, without reliable connections over long distances. But by 1870, long-distance travel became a practical option. Far more important than the opportunity to travel was the role of the railroad in freight delivery. Steady supply by railroads reduced the volatility of prices previously caused by frozen rivers and slow horse transportation, and thus in turn reduced the cost of goods and increased their variety. The quality and variety of food began to improve with the invention in the 1880s of the refrigerated railroad car. These early cars were not cooled mechanically, but had slots for blocks of ice, which made possible the widespread distribution of fresh fruit and vegetables from California and refrigerated fresh-cut meat from the Midwest. The refrigerated car made the beef industry much more efficient and eliminated the death marches in which herds of cattle had been driven on the hoof to large cities. Food quality and variety improved decade by decade, and contamination declined in tandem. As the produce and meat flowed from the agricultural regions and stockyards, the abundance of modern manufactured goods traveled by rail freight cars from the industrial cities to the small towns and farms. As early as 1869, mail sorting cars on passenger trains were introduced, and by the end of the 19th century, these had reduced mail delivery times to 1 or 2 days within a given region of the country. Rural free delivery, introduced in 1892, and U.S. mail parcel post service, introduced in 1913, greatly facilitated the meteoric rise of the mail-order catalog, which relied on the rail-driven mail to deliver catalogs to farmers and small-town residents, and orders from these customers back to the central catalog warehouses in Chicago. The growth of railroads and their influence on the standard of living is synonymous with Chicago's emergence as the world's fastest-growing city between 1870 and 1930. Cronin's 1991 account provides a fruitful organizing structure for the welfare benefits of railroads in the late 19th century. Railroads improved the standard of living of most Americans along many dimensions, and most of these can be illustrated with traffic flows into and out of Chicago. Because of the water barrier of Lake Michigan, every passenger or load of freight bound for Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, or anywhere north or northwest had to travel through Chicago. By 1905, about 14% of the world's railway mileage passed through Chicago. In addition to its role in funneling to market fresh produce from California and fresh meat from the Chicago stockyards, Chicago was also central in the building of the new territories in the Great Plains, as lumber merchants floated wood logs from Wisconsin forests to Chicago sawmills that created the cut lumber that was then sent by rail to build the houses, barns, retail buildings, and grain elevators of the Great West. By 1889, the 400-square-mile Chicago switching district, twice the size of the Chicago city limits, served 5,000 industries, 160 freight yards, and 76 freight stations. By the turn of the century, 650 freight trains arrived in or left Chicago daily on 30 railroads. Throughout the small towns of America, the railroad depot became the center from which the business district and beyond it, the residential area, radiated. The depot contained the telegraph office with its possibilities of instant communication to distant locations, Trips that would rarely have been contemplated before the arrival of the railroad network became commonplace for countless passengers. Through the railroad depot came newlyweds departing on honeymoon trips, school classes off to the city, young men departing for war. There arrived traveling salesmen with valises filled with samples, wives returning from shopping excursions loaded down with bundles, and coffins of the deceased returned home for burial. We tend to think of rail travel as a standard commodity that remained the same between the time the rails were laid down in the late 19th century until the time after World War II, when passenger rail travel shriveled and died, at least in the United States. However, an examination of railroad timetables tells a surprising story about speed, which improved steadily from 1870 to 1940. Improvements came from mergers, interconnections, better switching, roller bearings, and eventually, in the 1930s, the conversion from inefficient steam locomotives to diesel-electric propulsion and air-conditioned passenger cars. In the pre-computer age, planning rail trips relied heavily on the Official Guide of the Railways, which dated back to 1868. The guide provides a unique window on a world that no longer exists, at least within the United States, of an extremely dense railroad network that connected almost every city and town, no matter how small. As an example of this density, the local train between Portland and Bangor, Maine, in 1900, made 32 stops along its 135-mile route, one stop every 4.2 miles, and required 5 hours to do so, for an average speed of 27 miles per hour. Table 5.1 displays for 1870, 1900, and 1940 distances, elapsed times, and speeds on a variety of different routes, arranged from shorter distances on the top to longer distances at the bottom of the table. For each route, the elapsed time of the fastest train is listed, along with the slowest train providing direct service. In 1870, the speeds were less than 25 miles per hour, and in 1900 no faster than 40 miles per hour, even on the fastest luxury express trains. Surprisingly, the average speed on the Santa Fe's limited stop train from Chicago to Los Angeles in 1900, 27 miles per hour, was barely faster than on the local from Portland to Bangor. Although these speeds seem slow in retrospect, they seemed like rocket travel to those whose previous options included canal travel at 4 miles per hour, or stagecoaches at 5 to 6 miles per hour. In fact, the fastest horse travel that ever occurred over long distance was at 9 miles per hour, achieved by the Pony Express, with frequent changes of horses and express riders who were recruited to be as lightweight as today's horse racing jockeys. Speeds increased markedly by 1940, both because new diesel equipment could travel faster and because prestige services were introduced that had fewer stops than before. The fastest of the routes shown was the Denver Zephyr, introduced in 1934, which traveled the 134 miles from Chicago to Denver, making 12 stops at an average speed of 64.6 miles per hour. Almost as fast was the celebrated extra fare 20th Century Limited of the New York Central, covering 961 miles from New York to Chicago in 16 hours. The route between Chicago and Los Angeles witnessed a doubling of speed, from 27 miles per hour in 1900 to 56 miles per hour on the much-advertised Santa Fe Super Chief in 1940. Nevertheless, even in 1940, speeds and elapsed times fell far short of today's Japanese bullet trains and high-speed European rail. Table 5.1, by featuring the fastest trains between selected destinations, distorts the world of rail travel in the 1870 to 1940 period. Travel was much slower for those who were traveling not between major cities, but between small towns not on the same train line. Travel times in the year 1900 from one county seat to another, if they did not happen to be located on the same train line, usually involved origin to destination speeds of less than 10 miles per hour. Furthermore, the elapsed times for 1940 were also irrelevant for most travelers. There were supplemental charges for sleeping berths, and even for individual trains, such as the 20th Century Limited or Super Chief. The speeds attained were much slower on the ordinary trains that most passengers could afford. This suggests a little-discussed reason why air travel became so popular so rapidly after World War II. Most air travel took the passenger from origin to destination either non-stop or with one or two stops along the way, in contrast to the multiple or frequent stops inherent in passenger rail travel. The timetables reveal the Achilles heel of rail travel that made it so vulnerable to competition from air travel after World War II. The fabled Super Chief ran only 2 days per week rather than daily. More important for movie stars and others who wanted the fastest route from New York to Los Angeles, the fastest New York to Chicago trains of both the New York Central and Pennsylvania railroads arrived in Chicago at 8 a.m., whereas the Super Chief did not depart Chicago from another station until 7:15 p.m. This delay was taken for granted and led to booming business for Chicago merchants as well as for hotels, which rented rooms by the hour. Leisure travel by rail was still dominant in the 1920s, despite the emergence of the automobile. Because roads for automobile travel remained primitive and the automobiles themselves were unreliable, railroads advertised their ability to take people to multiple national parks on a single summer vacation and attracted school teachers and college students, some of whom worked in summer jobs at the parks. Passengers desperate to escape prohibition in the 1920s could take advantage of the combined Havana special train and steamboat service, which attracted thousands for weekends of drinking and gambling. Railroads also made it possible for families to establish summer homes on the shore in New England, Long Island, or New Jersey, as well as for fathers to maintain their weekday jobs while commuting to join their families on the shore on the weekends. The railroads reached ever more remote destinations, provided more elaborate and comfortable train stations, and offered even more through-train service with fewer transfers. But equally or more important from the passenger's viewpoint was the steady increase in comfort inside the train. In the late 19th century, immigrants were shipped west in filthy boxcars attached to freight or cattle trains. Wooden benches were the only place to sit, and the air was foul with the smell of food and tobacco. Robert Louis Stevenson, in an 1879 essay, offered a description of what he called Noah's Ark on wheels. The immigrant cars on the Union Pacific are only remarkable for their extreme plainness, and for the usual inefficacy of the lamps, which often went out and shed but a dying glimmer even while they burned. The benches are too short for anything but a young child. On the approach of night, the boards are laid from bench to bench, making a couch wide enough for two and long enough for a man of the middle height. So bad were conditions of travel in the 1870s that Lucius Beebe lamented, "The American public rode to dusty destinies in regimented discomfort." Train schedules were guesses more than guarantees, and connections were often missed, particularly in winter. The old wood-burning locomotives belched cinders that pattered overhead like a hailstorm, and their smoke and steam engulfed the train until, at journey's end, the traveler found himself begrimed like a man who has worked all day at a blacksmith's. American rail travel was less private than in Europe, where trains were divided up into enclosed compartments, typically seating 6 passengers. Another danger of railroad travel in the 1870s and 1880s was the reliance on kerosene lighting and unreliable cannonball stoves used for heating. These made the frequent crashes much worse, as the wooden cars often telescoped, one car riding up over the next, and then burned. These perils were gradually eased after the introduction on the railroads of steam heating in 1881 and electric light in 1892. A notable further step ahead in railroad comfort occurred in the 1930s, when the first overnight train with air conditioning was introduced in 1931. The introduction in the late 1860s of Pullman sleeping cars, which were attached to the long-distance passenger trains of every American railroad, was another major improvement. By 1925, Pullman cars accounted for one-third of the passenger miles carried by U.S. railroads and were served by 25,000 employees, most of whom were Pullman porters, the majority of whose income was received from tips. From the point of view of passengers, the porters converted long-distance railroad travel into a civilized and comfortable mode of transportation. Porter duties included carrying baggage from the platform to the compartment, making up beds with fresh linens, showing passengers how to adjust heating, and later air conditioning controls, and satisfying a wide variety of passenger requests. The Pullman cars continued to provide a standard level of comfort well into the period after World War II, when long-distance passenger rail travel was made functionally obsolete by the commercial airlines. The transition to diesel and electric-powered streamliner trains began with the Burlington's Zephyr in 1934. It combined air conditioning, reduced noise, faster speed, a better ride, and the elimination of smoke and cinders. The diesel engine produced 4 times as much work out of a pound of fuel as did the steam engine. Whether in primitive conditions in the 1870s, the more comfortable Pullman cars introduced in the late 19th century, or the sleek streamliners of the late 1930s, the epical transformation of American life by the railroad went far beyond passenger comfort or safety. Its influence is conveyed by the conclusion to Holbrook's comprehensive history of the American railroad. The classic iron horse spanned the continent in less than a man's lifetime, bounded with arteries that carried the blood of life into its most remote and inaccessible parts, that tamed its wilderness, softened its savagery, and civilized its places and people as nothing else could have done. All of this was done so quickly that the world of reflective men has not yet ceased to marvel. This is what the Iron Horse did for America. The commuter railroad, the emerging suburbs, and the horse-dependent city. Before the Civil War, transportation within cities was so slow that housing could spread only a few miles from centers of employment. Rich employers lived quite close to their working-class employees. Indeed, both walked to work. The walking city of the early 19th century was unlikely to be more than 3 miles in diameter, a distance that could be walked across in about an hour. This began to change with the arrival of the railroad, which provided to the rich and upper middle class an escape route from the teeming city. Starting in the 1850s, commuter railroads were established that followed the main intercity railroad corridors. Now the city began to appear not as a circle, but as a star, its points representing the new suburbs established along the rail lines extending out from the city. Because the early commuter railroads were propelled by steam engines, they shared the discomfort of smoke and cinders, hazards that could be alleviated only by closing all the windows and suffocating on hot summer days. But fast steam-powered commuter rail service was a futuristic world apart from the conditions of public transit within the city in the late 19th century, where until 1890, the horse was the dominant prime mover of intracity passenger and freight transportation. Steam engines could not be used on city streets because of fear of fires started by sparks, deafening noise, thick smoke, and heavy weight that shook foundations and cracked street pavements. The main mode of transportation in Philadelphia between 1850 and 1880 was still walking for 80% of residents. Movement about the city by any means other than walking depended on the horse. Horse-drawn carriages for hire served as the 19th century equivalent of the modern taxicab. Urban transit, whether the provider was privately owned or a public agency, had 3 characteristics that differentiated it from the taxi: reasonable price, fixed schedules, and predetermined routes. The earliest urban transit vehicle was the horse-drawn omnibus, a natural evolution of the stagecoach, which was approved for service initially in Paris in 1828 and London in 1832. Omnibus service grew rapidly after its 1833 introduction in New York City, and by 1853, the entrepreneur Jacob Sharp, soon to initiate streetcar service, counted 3,100 omnibuses, passing Chambers Street on Broadway within 13 hours, which translated into one every 15 seconds. Service spread rapidly in the 1840s and 1850s to most other large and medium-sized cities in the Northeast and Midwest. The omnibus was expensive to run, for rutted and muddy streets created so much friction that 3 horses were typically required to haul a bus occupied by 10 passengers. Quote, "It could take crews of men working with ropes and planks 2 days to rescue an omnibus that had slipped on the planking and into the quagmire." End quote. Young, 1998, page 36. The New York Herald opined in 1864, "Modern martyrdom must be succinctly described as riding in a New York omnibus." Even in New York City, there were few paved roads north of 42nd Street. Beyond that was only a dreary waste of unpaved and ungraded streets with a scattering of squatters' shanties. Even in the built-up area, there were many unpaved streets where passengers struggled through the mud to reach the horse cars and omnibuses. The condition of New York City streets was one of several reasons why Rudyard Kipling concluded in 1892 about the city that the more one studied it, the more grotesquely bad it grew. On the streets, gullies, holes, ruts, cobblestones awry, curbstones rising from 2 to 6 inches above the level of the slatternly pavement, tram lines from 2 to 3 inches above street level, building materials scattered half across the street, lime, boards, cut stone, and ash barrels generally and generously everywhere, wheeled traffic taking its chances, Dray versus Brougham at crossroads, and lastly, a generous scatter of filth and more mixed stinks than the winter wind can carry away. In any other land they would be held to represent slovenliness, sordidness, and want of capacity. Competition among drivers of competing companies led to collisions involving omnibuses, pedestrians, and horse-drawn wagons hauling merchandise. In 1853, a Philadelphia newspaper complained, "A ferocious spirit appears to have taken possession of the drivers, which defies law and delights in destruction." As a result of the high ratio of horses to passengers, fares were high, typically 12 cents per ride in New York City, at a time when working-class men earned only $1 per day. As a result, ridership mainly consisted of the upper middle class. A substantial advance was achieved with the conversion in the 1840s and 1850s to horse-drawn street railways, which forced the omnibus off the streets in many cities. The new so-called horse cars combined the low-cost flexibility and safety of animal power with the efficiency, smoothness, and all-weather capability of a rail right-of-way. Reduced friction enabled a pair of horses to pull 30 to 40 passengers in a vehicle that had more inside room, an easier exit, and more effective brakes than the typical omnibus. Average speeds doubled from 3 to 6 miles per hour. Average fares for a single ride dropped from 12 cents to 5 cents. Horse cars also introduced transit innovations that persist to this day, including a flat fare independent of distance, and multiple ride books of tickets sold to commuters at a discount. Still, only 17% of employed persons regularly rode the horse cars from home to work because of the expense. The apogee of the horse-drawn streetcar occurred in the 1880s, when more than 100,000 horses nationwide were engaged in pulling 18,000 streetcars on 3,000 miles of track. More than any other development in transportation, the horse-drawn streetcars made possible the separation of residence and workplace, a major change in the arrangement of cities that occurred primarily in the last half of the 19th century. Though horse cars were an advance over the horse-drawn omnibus, the conditions faced by passengers were primitive by modern standards. The cars were without heat or light, and crews put a foot of hay or straw on the floor in winter to help riders keep their feet warm. Initial attempts to place heaters under the floors were rejected after a number of fires resulted. Furthermore, as American cities grew and a gridlock of intersecting horse-car lines developed in cities like Chicago, criticism focused on the inherent defects of the horse itself as a machine of propulsion. Horses dropped thousands of tons of manure and gallons of urine on city streets, died in service, leaving 7,000 horse carcasses to be carried away each year in Chicago alone, and carried diseases transmissible to humans. The smell of manure heaps and the clouds of flies they attracted was some of the most objectionable nuisances stables created. The nuisance was especially bad in the summer. On New York's Liberty Street, there was a manure heap 7 feet high. New York streets were often covered with layers of manure. Replacing the horse. Cable cars, electrified streetcars, and rapid transit. The search for a replacement of the horse preoccupied individual entrepreneurs and city planners in the last half of the 19th century. The most obvious solution was the steam railroad, but we have already seen that this was not suitable for use on city streets. An initial replacement for the horse-drawn streetcars was the cable car, where the motive power came from a steam boiler that generated the power to pull the cables through grooves under the street. Cable cars are always associated with San Francisco, where they began service in 1873 as a response to the difficulty of horses in pulling loads up the steep San Francisco hills. In fact, the largest cable car system in the late 19th century was established in Chicago in 1882, and the motivation was not hills, but the desire to draw longer trains with larger loads than was possible with horses. Also, the cable car could travel at 9 to 10 miles per hour, almost double the speed of a horse-drawn streetcar. At its peak, the Chicago system extended over 86 miles of cable tracks and was powered by 13 large steam engines. It played a major role in extending the residential reach of the city. It was estimated at the time to have removed from a street the voidings of 2,000 or 3,000 horses. The peak of the cable car's role occurred on October 23, 1893, when on a single day, the Chicago cable car system hauled 700,000 people to and from the Columbian Exposition. Over their brief 15-year hegemony in Chicago, cable cars accelerated the outward reach of the city. Whenever a cable line replaced a horse-car line, property values increased by 30% to 100%. But the cable cars did not last long. They had disappeared from the streets of most cities by 1900 and from Chicago by 1906, and they remain to this day only in the single city of San Francisco, where they are primarily a tourist attraction. Just as the cable network in Chicago and elsewhere was expanding rapidly in the 1880s, the far more efficient option of electric traction became feasible. The central entrepreneur who guided the electric revolution was Frank J. Sprague, an Englishman who, after briefly working for Thomas Edison, was lured to Richmond, Virginia, to devise a system of electric streetcars capable of climbing that city's hills. It was Sprague who perfected the distribution of power from central stations via overhead wires to flexible trolleys that would move back and forth to maintain their grip on the overhead wire and maintain a continuous flow of electric power to the motor installed underneath the streetcar platform. After Sprague demonstrated his system's success with so-called trolley cars, the rush was on to electrify the streetcars of America. Within 2 years of the implementation of Sprague's successful Richmond system, more than 200 electrified streetcar systems were operating across the country. Between 1895 and 1930, the vast majority of urban transit passengers were carried on electric streetcars. And even in 1940, the motorized bus had not yet caught up in its passenger share. The total of electrified trackage recorded by the first national census of streetcars in 1890 was already 1,260 miles, or roughly 17% of the total trackage of the streetcar industry, including horse-drawn, cable-drawn, and electrified. By 1902, total trackage had tripled, and the share that was electrified had exploded to 98% of the total. The era of the trolley car had begun. Because electric power was brought into each streetcar by its overhead trolley, power was available not just for traction, but also to provide electric interior lighting and heat. By 1902, nearly 5 billion passengers annually rode the streetcars, compared to 2 billion in 1890. Despite the efficiency of electricity-powered streetcars, they were still subject to urban congestion, for they all operated at street level along with horse-drawn delivery wagons, private carriages, and horse-drawn taxis. Many photos of downtown Chicago in the 1890 to 1910 era display complete gridlock, and in one photo 14 streetcars are visible on a single city block. The convergence of streetcar lines into the center of each city's downtown core made possible the primacy of the urban department store, which tended to be located near the hub of the trolley lines. This central streetcar hub of the city, whether State Street in Chicago or Herald Square in Manhattan, not only brought customers to the grand department stores, such as Marshall Field's and Macy's, but also was surrounded by new skyscrapers made possible by structural steel, the elevator, electric light, ventilation systems, and telephone networks. The solution to congestion in densely packed U.S. cities emerged from London, where the Metropolitan Railway Underground Line opened its service with steam engine propulsion in 1863. By definition, an underground or overhead elevated service could bypass all traffic congestion on the surface. New York's elevated trains predated electricity, and by 1876, with steam propulsion, were running 40 trains a day from the Battery to 59th Street. And by 1880, 4 elevated lines had reached the northern tip of Manhattan. Chicago's elevated trains followed 16 years later, when elevated tracks opened for service in 1892, intended to allow small steam engines to bring visitors to the 1893 Columbian Exposition. For the 1893 fair itself, a 3-mile elevated loop circled the fairgrounds, the first to be propelled by electric motors located under the carriages, which drew power from an adjacent third rail. While these elevated tracks were demolished immediately after the fair, by 1896, pre-existing elevated lines powered by steam had been converted to electric traction using third rail power. The very same Frank Sprague who had invented the overhead trolley system for electric streetcars was instrumental in the development of the multiple-unit system of propulsion for rapid transit elevated and underground trains, which used no locomotive, but rather electric motors underneath multiple interconnected passenger cars, allowing rapid stopping and starting. The most important aspect of this innovation was that although some cars had motors and some did not, all the cars with motors could be controlled by a single motorman. Automatic closure of the doors came later. Early elevated and subway trains had one conductor for every 2 cars to open and close the doors manually. Just as horse cars were an improvement over the early omnibus, so elevated trains were an improvement over the horse car and, for speed, over the electric streetcar. Yet just as horse cars suffered from the inherent defects of the horse, the elevated trains also had their disadvantages. The elevated structures blocked out the sun and sky and darkened the streets below, and the constant passing of trains on overhead rails created an incessant and unpleasant barrage of noise. Since the opening of the London Underground in 1863, American inventors had attempted to gain public support for an underground system. Finally, the first underground system opened, not in New York, but under Tremont Street in Boston in 1897. Along its 4 tracks could travel 400 streetcars an hour, double the capacity of the surface street before the subway was built. In its first year, it carried 50 million passengers along its length of less than 2 miles. As predicted by its promoters, it immediately reduced congestion in the city streets above. The effect was like that when a barrier is removed from the channel of a clogged river, wrote the Boston Daily Globe soon after the opening. The first New York City subway line opened in 1904 and was a more ambitious project, extending 15 miles from City Hall to the northern limits of the city. Built from the beginning with 4 tracks, its express trains traveled at 40 miles per hour between stops, much more quickly than streetcars and also more quickly than the competing elevated lines, which were limited to 12 miles per hour. By 1940, the New York City subways and remaining elevated trains facilitated 3 billion of the 5 billion annual journeys on public transit in that city. And as of 1940, it was still possible to ride a subway train all the way from Coney Island to the Bronx for a mere 5 cents. No discussion of public transit during 1870 to 1940 is complete without a separate treatment of the interurbans, which combined the faster speeds of steam railroads in carrying passengers between adjacent cities with the flexibility of the electric motor. Interurbans had 2 advantages over the steam railroad. First, their routes combined surface travel within the city with high-speed travel between cities. Second, their electric traction was much cheaper to operate than a steam locomotive. The first lines were established soon after the invention of the trolley car in 1891 between Minneapolis and St. Paul, and by 1905, the interurbans were ubiquitous. In that year, the Pacific Electric Interurban connected 42 cities and towns in the Los Angeles area. By 1910, all but 187 of the miles between Chicago and New York City were connected by a host of different but interconnecting interurban lines. By 1925, public transit in the United States had reached its peak of 383 annual rides per person in cities of 25,000 in population or more, not including those who traveled on steam railroads and the interurbans. The streetcars had an 85% share of transit ridership in 1922, which fell to 50% by 1940. The share of rapid transit, elevated and subways, was barely changed, whereas the combined shares of the motor bus and trolley coach jumped from 3% to 36%. Except for the years of World War II, when tires and gasoline were rationed, public transit would never again attain the peak ridership reached between 1913 and 1923. The gradual decline of transit was largely, but not entirely, owing to the availability of ever cheaper and better automobiles. Also contributing to the decline was a cost squeeze, for many public transit franchises were forced by contract to charge a nominal fixed fare of 5 cents, which made many operations uneconomic after the general price level rose by 74% between 1913 and 1923. Another example of the standard economic indictment of price controls. By the end of World War I, 1/3 of all transit companies were bankrupt. The automobile arrives. Its immediate benefits. Few inventions in human history have equaled the internal combustion engine in their effects. Inventors had experimented for much of the previous century attempting to develop a self-propelled engine based on coal-produced gas. By 1876, Nikolaus Otto had developed a 4-stroke compression engine, but it did not develop enough power to be suitable for transportation. In one of the greatest coincidences in the history of technology, the successful trial of a 2-stroke engine by Carl Benz on New Year's Eve in 1879 occurred just 10 weeks after Edison's epical success in developing the electric light bulb on October 22nd. By 1886, Benz had developed a 4-stroke successor to the original engine and mounted it on a 3-wheel chassis, the very first horseless carriage. But unlike Edison's discovery, which illuminated department stores and powered streetcars within its first few years, the internal combustion engine took longer to make a noticeable dent in everyday activities. And unlike Edison's Made in America discoveries, most of the seminal inventions of the internal combustion engine and the motor car were made in Europe, particularly in Germany, during the late 19th century. Just as the railroads required a series of technical improvements between 1830 and 1850, so the automobile benefited from a sequence of developments before its emergence around 1910 as a dominant form of transportation and a driving force in the leap to supremacy of America's standard of living. Over the period of 1890 to 1910, a host of challenges were surmounted that seem mundane today, but that were crucial to the future of the motor car industry. Steering was achieved by linking the two front wheels with a rod so that they moved in unison. The engine was moved from under the carriage-like seat to the front of the vehicle, which provided room for even larger engines. Spark plugs, carburetors, transmissions, and self-starters were invented and gradually improved. Solutions to many mundane problems had already been solved during the 1890s by the mass production of the bicycle, including the development of cold-rolled steel, accurately machined gears, ball and needle bearings, and pneumatic tires. Between 1887 and 1894, 24 U.S. patents were issued for the rubber tire and the crucial problem of its adherence to a metal wheel. By 1906, Wilhelm Maybach had developed a six-cylinder engine that approximated the power of today's four-cylinder compact cars, such as the Honda Civic. Such was the speed of invention that an approximate, albeit clumsy and heavy, replica of today's modern cars could have been produced within a mere 2 decades after the invention of the internal combustion engine. This is a classic example of a theme of this book, that many inventions are one-time-only events, subject to a long succession of subsequent incremental improvements. Historians have long recognized that the automobile is European by birth, American by adoption. It is ironic that the development of the automobile as an inexpensive vehicle for mass transportation was dominated by Americans, particularly Henry Ford and other pioneers. Yet the early development of the internal combustion engine and the automobile was dominated by Germans. Benz, Otto, Daimler, and Maybach, with a French role for Peugeot and Levasseur. The shift of automobile innovation from Germany to the United States in the 1900 to 1910 decade reflected not only the retirement or death of the leading German entrepreneurs at that time, but also the frenetic attempts by American entrepreneurs to copy the technical advances that had been achieved by Mercedes and other German automakers. The automobile took off slowly at the beginning, with just 8,000 U.S. registrations in 1900 and 78,000 in 1905. Travel was difficult for longer than the shortest distances. A Vermont doctor and his chauffeur were the first to succeed in driving a car across the country from San Francisco to New York, but it took them 63 days. The slow initial adoption of the automobile is consistent with a 1906 survey of the Minneapolis City Engineers Department, which counted vehicles in 10 different 24-hour periods. Mean daily figures were 2,722 horse-drawn vehicles, fully 2/3 trotting, less than 3 horse riders, 786 bicyclists, and only 183 automobiles. The minimal number of individual horse riders reflected the high initial and maintenance cost of horses, but the transition was extremely rapid. By 1917, a similar survey in Pittsburgh counted twice as many motor-powered vehicles as horse-drawn, and by 1927, quote, "The downtown had begun to look, sound, and smell like the downtown of today. Almost 50 times as many gasoline-powered as horse-drawn vehicles entered," end quote. The small town of Oregon, Illinois, was apparently further ahead than Pittsburgh when a similar count in 1916 registered a greater than 5-to-1 advantage of motorized vehicles over horse-drawn. 1,171 to 215. The automobile was instantly superior to the horse-drawn carriage and replaced horse-drawn vehicles as soon as horse owners could afford to buy the new horseless carriages. The limitations of the horse went beyond its piles of manure. Horses could pull vehicles only at around 6 miles per hour and had a range of no more than 25 miles before a given horse became exhausted and had to be replaced. The early development of the automobile exhibits several parallels to that of electricity. Both of these great inventions faced initial competition. Electricity for lighting had to compete with coal gas. Electrified streetcars had to compete with horse cars. Interurban electrified trains had to compete with steam trains. And even electric elevators had initial competition from pneumatic elevators. In the same way, motor transport had to overcome competition from electric streetcars and interurban trains, not to mention steam-powered long-distance trains. Before internal combustion technology became dominant after 1905, it had to compete with attempts to develop competing steam-powered or electric-powered motor vehicles. Much of the enthusiastic transition away from urban mass transit to automobiles reflected the inherent flexibility of the internal combustion engine. It could take you directly from your origin point to your destination with no need to walk to a streetcar stop, board a streetcar, often change to another streetcar line, which required more waiting, and then walk to your final destination. Whether it was faster didn't matter, for it eliminated the need to wait for streetcars and, particularly, to haul packages, which instead could be placed on the back seat of the motor car. The 20th century urban ridership despised fixed rail transit. The dream of freedom and country living made possible by the automobile was evident to an observer as early as 1904. Imagine a healthier race of working men who, in the late afternoon, glide away in their own comfortable vehicles to their little farms or houses in the country, or by the sea 20 or 30 miles distant. They will be healthier, happier, more intelligent, and self-respecting citizens because of the chance to live among the meadows and flowers of the country, instead of in crowded city streets. The first decades of the automobile, prices plummet as quality takes off. In its first decade, the automobile was owned mainly by the wealthy, who could choose from a cornucopia of designs, each manufactured in small quantities. Table 5.2 traces the epical progress in reducing the price and raising the quality of automobiles during the 1906 to 40 interval. The left column provides data on the best-selling car of 1903 to 5, the Oldsmobile Curved Dash Runabout, and the rows below provide the price of the lowest-priced model together with basic specifications. The next rows below the line provide alternative measures of quality and quality-adjusted price, including weight divided by horsepower, price divided by weight, a quality index based on a weighted average of horsepower and weight, and a quality-adjusted price index. The bottom section of the table compares both raw prices and quality-adjusted prices to personal disposable income per person as a measure of the affordability of automobiles over this interval of nearly 4 decades. The automobile revolution began in earnest with the appearance of Henry Ford's Model T, which began production in late 1908 and continued in production until 1927. The second column of Table 5.2 lists the introductory Model T of 1909 to 10, which was introduced at a price of $950. The genius of Ford's design combined several elements. The car had relatively high horsepower, 22 horsepower, for its weight, 1,200 pounds. Its gear torque allowed it to pull itself through mud that would have stranded heavier vehicles. Its unique 2-pedal planetary transmission eliminated the need to shift gears, and it was simple and easy to service by farmers, who had ready access to parts through mail-order catalogs. It was sturdy, reliable, and easy to drive by the standards of the time. At least superficially, the quality measures in the middle rows of Table 5.2 do not provide evidence of a quantum leap for the Model T. Though its ratio of weight to horsepower improved radically, and its quality index was 32% higher, its price was also higher, making its quality-adjusted price actually higher than that of the 1906 Oldsmobile. But this ignores the unique ability of the Model T's design to handle dirt roads, a feature that endeared it to the nation's farmers and that helped account for its overwhelming success. And before long, its price declined far below that of any other automobile, even as its quality continued to improve. Whereas previous cars had been unable to push the weight-to-horsepower ratio below 80-1, Ford's lightweight design achieved a new frontier at 55-1, as shown in Table 5.2. The efficiency of the lightweight and high-power design was demonstrated when in 1909, a Model T defeated a stable of heavier, pricier touring automobiles in a 4,100-mile race from New York to Seattle. Ford's special place in U.S. entrepreneurial history went beyond design, for it was his production innovations that allowed him to reduce the price by so much. At his famous Highland Park factory, which opened in January 1, 1910, he adopted vertical integration, including the making of most parts in-house. By 1913, the moving assembly line made mass production a reality, breaking up the labor processes into repetitive motions as the cars slowly moved past each worker performing his task. Also by 1913, Ford had established a network of almost 7,000 dealers and reached small towns having as few as 2,000 inhabitants. 65% of Ford dealers were in rural areas. After the Model T became ubiquitous, its unique network of dealers and service stations, selling tires, batteries, spare parts, and the cars themselves, created the same sort of networking advantage that Apple and Android enjoy today in their smartphone duopoly. The differences between the quality attributes of the Model T and any post-1925 car are as night and day. The driver of the Model T, quote, climbs in by the right-hand door, for there is no left-hand door, sets the spark and throttle levers. Then he gets out to crank. Seizing the crank in his right hand, carefully he slips his left forefinger through a loop of wire that controls the choke. He pulls the lop of wire. He revolves the crank mightily, and as the engine at last roars, he leaps to the trembling running board, leans in, and moves the spark and throttle. End quote. The quality of the Model T did not stand still just because it maintained the same model number designation for 20 years. Even as the price declined, accessories that were once available only at extra expense became standard by 1915, including headlights, windshields, a top, a horn, and a speedometer. Electric starters had begun to replace the hand crank and were universal by 1921. Today, one is puzzled at the automobile advertisements from the 1910 to 25 period, almost all of which display topless vehicles without permanent covers. Only 10% of cars were covered with canvas or metal roofs in 1919, but closed-top vehicles rapidly took over, including closed-top versions of the Model T, and comprised 43% of automobile sales in 1924 and 85% in 1927. Throughout the era when the Ford lacked widely desired accessories, a giant aftermarket developed to sell new steel fenders for safety and streamlined style, as well as tops, radiator hoods, and mundane items such as a gas gauge. By the early 1920s, the Sears catalog offered 5,000 different accessory items for the Model T. Mass production kept the price of the Model T much lower than that of most competing cars, and its price in both nominal and real terms continued to decline throughout its two-decade production run, during which 15 million Model T Fords were produced. In fact, by 1914, the Model T had taken over 46% of the U.S. market for new automobiles, rising to almost 55% in its peak year of 1923, when 1.8 million were produced and sold. Table 5.2 compares the 1910 and 1923 Model Ts in adjacent columns. There was little change in specification except for an increase in weight owing to the conversion of previously optional features to standard equipment. The big change was the sharp drop in price from $950 to $269 for a car that was heavier and better in almost every dimension. The ratio of price to weight fell by 76%, and the quality-adjusted price by 73%. However, after 1923, the sales of the Model T began to decline. For 20 years of innovation had made it possible for competing firms, especially General Motors, to build faster, more powerful, and more comfortable vehicles. Partially meeting the demands of its critics, Ford's replacement for the Model T, called the Model A, included many features previously lacking, including shock absorbers, a windshield wiper, combination taillights and brake lights, bumpers, and an instrument panel featuring a speedometer, oil, and gas gauges. The 1928 Ford Model A boosted the quality index from 137 to 179, though it also resulted in an increase in the quality-adjusted price from $196 to $268, in part because of many improvements that went beyond horsepower and weight. Table 5.2 displays data for two other models that were leading sellers, the 1934 and 1940 Chevrolets. The latter model had 85 horsepower, within striking distance of today's compact cars, and a quality index compared to the 1906 Oldsmobile of 248. The price-to-weight ratio was only slightly higher than that of the 1923 Model T, despite myriad improvements beyond higher weight, and the quality-adjusted price was about the same as that of the 1928 Model A Ford. The 1940 Chevrolet was a modern car in its ability to travel as fast as road quality would allow, even if it lacked the automatic transmission, air conditioning, and other amenities now standard on all cars. It represented a quantum leap in quality, not only from the 1906 Oldsmobile Runabout, but also from the Model T. Figure 5.3 summarizes the behavior of automobile prices for the top-selling models listed in Table 5.2. The white line shows the raw, unadjusted price, which traces the decline in the Model T price from 1910 to 1923, followed by the increase in price of the Model A Ford and the two Chevrolets. But all this increase in price after 1923 was offset by higher quality, so the quality-adjusted price remains unchanged after 1923. Finally, the black line shows an even greater decline in the ratio of the quality-adjusted price to nominal disposable income per person, demonstrating that much of the rapid adoption of the automobile between 1910 and 1929 reflected a substitution response to a rapid decline in price relative to income. Automobiles and paved roads, chicken and egg. The most important hindrance to the development of motor transport was the lack of paved roads. The revolutionary 1901 Mercedes, commonly called the first modern automobile, sold in the United States at the price of $12,450 in an era when the average annual income was less than $1,000, and it could cruise at a speed of 50 miles per hour. Faster than the elapsed railroad times for 1900 shown in Table 5.1. But it could only reach that speed on roads that were smoothly paved. European cars, including those imported to the United States, placed the chassis close to the road to increase stability during rapid cornering. But these European cars were almost useless on American roads, which were described in 1903 as simply two deep ruts with a stony ridge in the middle on which the car bottom will drag. The first few years of the 20th century saw political gridlock about paving rural roads, in part because of the free rider problem. Residents of one county worried that if their county paved its roads, residents of an adjacent county would take advantage of them without paving its own. The attire of the average county automobile driver reflected the condition of the roads. Sheets and hats were worn, and travel bags were wrapped in blankets to keep out the dust. Extreme cold, snow, rain, and dryness made travel unpleasant as well as unpredictable. Flat tires and blowouts were common. However, some authors suggest that road building came earlier and made possible the automobile, a contrast to the usual view that the development of the automobile spurred road building. One impetus for road building was the craze for the bicycle in the 1890s, with its encouragement of individual freedom to explore. Another impetus to the development of better roads was the introduction by the U.S. Postal Service of rural free delivery, starting in 1899, and rural parcel delivery starting in 1913. RFD was an important source of pressure for road improvements, for the post office refused to deliver mail unless roads were of a certain minimum quality. If good roads were necessary for RFD, then farmers agitated for good roads. Thus, the public outcry for good roads antedated the automobile. Though the people promoting good roads wanted to improve recreation and rural culture, they had to center their efforts on horses and work. America's 2 million miles of roads in 1904 were largely dirt tracks connecting farms to towns. If all the hard-surfaced roads in the nation had been laid end-to-end in 1900, they would not have stretched from New York to Boston. In the entire state of Illinois in 1900, there were only 26 miles of surfaced rural roads. A full census of roads as of December 31, 1914, tallied up a total of 29,000 miles of good roads and 257,000 miles of surfaced roads, which usually meant gravel. Figure 5.1, introduced earlier to display railroad mileage, also exhibits the history of the development of fully paved highway mileage. The Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 began federal support of road construction, and continuous records of American highway mileage are available back to 1923. In the early 1920s, improved highway mileage was barely 20% of railroad mileage. But the rapid growth, particularly in the interstate highway construction era of 1956 to 1975, left railroad mileage in the dust. The measure of highway mileage here is weighted by capital expenditure, and thus counts a 4-lane interstate highway with interchanges as having twice or more the mileage of a 2-lane paved rural road of equal length. The development of roads did not just involve added mileage or paved roads. Other innovations came early. The technology of road building steadily improved between 1900 and 1930 and included the development of asphalt and concrete as durable road surfaces. Numbered highways began in Wisconsin in 1918. The white center line in the middle of the highway dates back to Michigan in 1911. The stop sign was first used in Detroit in 1915. And the modern 3-color electric traffic signal was fully developed between 1910 and 1920. The first road atlas, once much more necessary than today to report to drivers on the improved and unimproved conditions of specific routes, was introduced in 1926. In that same year, a uniform route numbering system was introduced, ranging from the designation of the Atlantic Coast Highway as US 1, its Pacific Coast counterparts as US 99 and 101, the Lincoln Highway as US 30, and the Old National Road, first developed from Maryland to Ohio in the 1830s, as US 40. Nevertheless, unpaved highways continued to be a hazard throughout the 1920s. A U.S. map of 1926 that distinguishes between paved and unpaved highways looks almost identical to a map of the U.S. railroad system in 1861. There were virtually no paved roads west of the Mississippi River, except along the Pacific coast. On these unpaved roads, just as mud was a hazard from fall through winter and spring, so dust was a constant nuisance in the summer. Nevertheless, the federal aid program during the 1920s and 1930s rapidly covered the nation with a network of 2-lane paved highways that allowed drivers to travel from coast to coast on designated major routes without encountering a stretch of rutted, unpaved road. The 1930s witnessed the construction of multi-lane engineering marvels, including the George Washington, Golden Gate, and Bay Bridges, as well as the beginning of multi-lane limited-access turnpikes, including the Merritt Parkway in southern Connecticut and the first section of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. These anticipated, and in some cases became part of, the post-war interstate highway system. As of 1940, a map of the principal routes of the U.S. highway system looks virtually identical to a map of today's interstate highway system, except that most of the roads were two-lane with intersections rather than featuring limited access. Automobiles replaced the horse in public transit. Despite the overnight conversion from horse cars to electrified streetcars in the 1890s, the national population of horses grew by 25% in the 1890s, for horses remained the primary means of power in both urban commerce and rural agriculture. The continued role of horses despite the invention of steam railroads and urban electric streetcars reflected a technological complementarity. Steam railroads and urban electric streetcars had the same limitation: fixed rails. As the economy grew, it was still dependent on the horse for the flexible travel to any final destination, a role that would be supplanted by motor transport, starting in 1900. The inconvenience, filth, and disease caused by horses was everywhere to be seen. Horses were ubiquitous in the urban landscape, standing, walking, trotting, sometimes shying, starting, falling, rearing, plunging, or bolting. They were large beings with which to share space. The smells of manure, sweat, and horsehair mingled with other urban smells of garbage, human waste, and industrial production. Horses contributed to the symphony of urban noise, hooves clattering and scrapping on the streets, wagons rattling and banging, wheels creaking, harnesses jingling, horses whinnying, neighing, groaning, and bugling. Within a decade, the electric streetcar had replaced the horse car. It took longer for the automobile to replace public transit, but the initial threat of the automobile to the established fixed-rail regime was already widespread by 1910 in the form of the jitneys, unlicensed taxicabs which operated in a free-for-all to cruise the routes of the streetcars and pick up passengers, especially those loaded with packages. The streetcar operators were particularly irked to see that the jitneys paid no taxes and faced no regulations. The first motor bus arrived on New York's Fifth Avenue in 1905, but the development of the motor bus was surprisingly low. The initial bus designs were converted trucks, with the center of gravity high off the ground. The first motor bus approximating modern design was introduced by the Fagel brothers in Oakland, California in 1920 in the form of the Fagel Safety Coach. Its platform and seats were close to the ground, requiring only 1 or 2 steps for entry. Springs were designed for passenger comfort, previously unnecessary in the trucks from which earlier buses were adopted. Though the motor bus was slow to appear, its adoption was rapid after 1920. The benefits over streetcars lay not only in the obvious lack of need to build expensive tracks and the ability of a bus to travel anywhere in newly developed residential areas, but also in mechanical advantages. The motor bus could accelerate and stop more quickly than a streetcar, and the replacement of the streetcar's steel wheels with rubber tires greatly increased rider comfort and reduced vibration and noise. As inner-city roads were gradually improved between 1910 and 1930, pioneers from all walks of life developed the inner-city bus business. By the mid-1920s, technology had evolved to produce buses that had 100 horsepower engines, that could seat 30 passengers, and that included heating and ventilating systems, interior baggage racks, and in some cases, toilet facilities. The bus had such advantage of routing flexibility and operating costs over the steam railroad that railroad companies began to operate their own bus fleets in place of thinly traveled branch lines. The first coast-to-coast bus service in 1928 made 132 stops and covered the distance from Los Angeles to New York in 5 days, 14 hours. By the end of the 1930s, despite many bankruptcies of small bus lines during the Great Depression, intercity bus travel was well established, accounting for 28% of intercity passenger traffic. Most citizens in 1900 did not have a mode of transportation that allowed them to move from a specific origin to a specific destination. They were slaves of the fixed rail system, both of the intercity steam railroads and of the intracity electric streetcars. Horses were too expensive and inconvenient for ordinary citizens to maintain. Most homes would not have enough space for a horse, or the means to keep it fed. So people walked to a livery stable, rented a horse, and rode or drove with it to a destination. But then the horse would need to be left at that destination, perhaps for many hours, until the time to return. The inanimate motor vehicle solved many problems. It could be kept near the home, driven anywhere, and then turned off and locked at the destination, with no need for further food or maintenance. Many urban residents who could not handle the expense, stabling space, or maintenance needs of a horse bought automobiles in the early years of 1900 to 1915. Automobiles also provided an increasingly protected private space, an extension of the private home, which surrounded people, even as they traveled farther and faster than ever before. The freedom to explore and to be released from the fixed train and streetcar schedules played a role in the decline of public transportation. Deliberate urban policy in the form of street surfacing encouraged automobile and truck traffic. The grim picture of decline usually painted is only a small portion of the story of urban transportation. Cities and the people in them, to a large extent, chose their form of transportation. Because ridership stagnated and then started to decline, few street railways were able to raise capital to extend their lines to new housing developments. A vicious circle began, augmented by Henry Ford's success in reducing automobile prices, even as rising transit worker wages and stagnating transit system productivity put upward pressure on fares. In real terms, adjusted for overall inflation, between 1912 and 1930, the cost of motor vehicle operation declined by 78%, and the cost of automobile purchase declined by 63%. But the cost of the average transit fare declined by only 6%. Streetcar systems were particularly vulnerable in middle-sized cities that did not have a commuter rail station or other central node to concentrate traffic. And in these cities, automobiles could circulate freely without motor vehicle congestion. Because the transit lines were privately owned, they had no choice but to respond to declining ridership by cutting service. Fewer routes and longer waiting times further reduced the appeal of transit compared to that of the automobile. Figure 5.4 plots motor vehicle registrations per household, also shown separately for automobiles and trucks for the period 1900 to 2012. This chart in absolute numbers minimizes the rapidity of the spread of automobiles in the era before World War II. When expressed as a percentage of the number of households, motor vehicle registrations exploded from 0.1 in 1900 to 2.3 in 1910, to 38.3 in 1920, to 89.8 in 1930, and to 93.0 in 1940. Thus, by 1930, there were almost as many motor vehicles as households in the United States, and an astonishing 78% of the world's automobiles were registered in the United States. Figure 5.5 provides a separate comparison of railroad passenger miles per person, copied from Figure 5.2, with motor vehicle miles. As shown by the log scale, the rate of growth of vehicle miles dwarfs anything achieved by the railroads after 1880. Indeed, vehicle miles surpassed railroad passenger miles during World War I. The surge of railroad patronage and simultaneous decline in automobile travel during World War II had the same cause: the rationing of gasoline and rubber tires, and after the war, vehicle miles continued their relentless rise while railroad passenger miles drifted inexorably lower. The United States was unique in its immediate acceptance of automobiles, at a rate that we can attribute, in part, to Henry Ford's genius at producing durable but inexpensive vehicles, as well as to the minimal cost of World War I to the United States, in contrast to the substantial economic cost of that war and its aftermath for the most prosperous nations in Europe. That the United States could produce 6 million internal combustion engines in 1929 alone goes a long way toward explaining how the United States produced so many motor-powered vehicles, including aircraft, during World War II. Automobiles transform life on farms and in small towns. In a nation in which 35% of the population still lived on farms in 1900, and in which more than 85% of horses were on the farm rather than in the city, very high on the list of benefits of the automobile was its promise to end the plague of rural isolation. The quality of rural life on farms and even in small towns was fundamentally handicapped by the obstacles of time and distance. Poor transportation kept farmers from social gatherings, with those beyond a radius of a few miles reachable by horse and buggy, in contrast to urban residents who needed to travel only from house to house or block to block for their interpersonal contact. Social contacts were few and commonly limited within a radius of a few miles. The educational facilities were meager, and the opportunity to bargain in the sale of farm products or the purchase of supplies was almost absent. All this has been revolutionized by motor vehicles. It may seem unbelievable from today's perspective, but the appearance of the first automobile in each town and small city was a major event. The Oregon Republican reported the arrival of each new automobile in that Illinois city over the entire 1900 to 1910 decade. Farmers' immediate enthusiasm for the automobile went beyond the end of rural isolation and the ability of the motor vehicle to perform farm tasks. Automobiles changed the meaning of leisure time for farm families. The Sunday drive quickly developed into a rural institution, including visits to friends and the new ability to go beyond the local village for recreation, culture, church events, and shopping. The common interest of farmers in improved rural roads brought them actively into the political process, many for the first time. The speed of transformation of farm transportation was one of the fastest of any invention in American history, and indeed rivals the speed of diffusion of the Internet after 1995. By 1924, the 6.5 million U.S. farms were equipped with 4.2 million automobiles, 370,000 trucks, and 450,000 tractors. The equivalent figure for vehicles owned in 1909 would have been close to zero. So this transformation took place in a mere 15 years. By 1926, fully 93% of farmers in Iowa had automobiles, a higher percentage than in urban America. The automobile changed the look of small towns. Downtown streets were widened and surfaced with all-weather pavement. Horse-related merchants such as liveries and harness, carriage, and blacksmith shops were replaced by automobile showrooms or repair shops, and horse accessories were removed from streets, including hitching posts and watering troughs. Painted parking stripes appeared on downtown streets, and signs slowly arrived to regulate parking and signals to regulate traffic. The previously clear delineation between the central business and residential districts became increasingly blurred as the space-consuming byproducts of the automobile age expanded, including parking lots, automobile dealerships, repair shops, and service stations. And the disruption of business occurred in the countryside as well as in the city. Among the casualties of the new independence of farmers were the Crossroads General Store and many small independent local banks. The smaller the town, the greater the threat to local merchants, as the automobile allowed farmers and local small-town residents to drive to the nearest large town or small city. Previous loyalties to the local merchants were frayed as the circumference of feasible travel expanded. The automobile seemed destined to loosen ties and tangle the horizon before the unsettled. Another victim of the automobile revolution was the one-room schoolhouse, as students could now be transported by motorbus to larger consolidated school districts. Broader effects of the transition to motorcars. Three factors help explain the automobile's rapid acceptance. First, it was viewed as a necessity by farmers and was purchased enthusiastically as soon as the Model T brought a tough and practical vehicle within the price range, feasible for a farmer. Second, the spread of automobiles in the 1920s was greatly facilitated by the development of consumer credit. By 1926, fully 75% of new automobiles were financed on time. Though installment credit had previously been sporadically available for expensive purchases such as pianos and sewing machines, the popularity of automobile credit soon made it routine for households to finance electric appliances in the same way. But by far the most important reason for the rapid diffusion of automobile ownership through 1929 was the rapid decline in prices, an achievement largely brought about by Ford's Model T and unmatched in any other nation. As shown in the bottom section of Table 5.2, the ratio of the purchase price of a Model T to nominal personal disposable income per person declined from 3.16 in 1910 to 0.43 in 1923. That is, by 1923, a new Model T cost only 43% of annual disposable income per person, which for a family of four meant only 11% of total family income. Because most new automobile purchases in the 1920s were paid for using installment credit, the annual burden could be 5% or less of annual income, making the automobile affordable for all but the poorest of the nation's households. Many contemporary quotations indirectly explain the rapid adoption of the motor car by the simple fact that it was viewed as a more important and vital invention than even the indoor bathroom. One Indiana farm housewife is reported to have said in 1925, "You can't go into town in a bathtub." Another mother of 9 children remarked, "We'd rather do without clothes than to give up the car. We don't have no fancy clothes when we have the car to pay for." The Lynns, in their detailed 1929 study of Muncie, Indiana, which was cited frequently in Chapter 4, reported that they surveyed 26 particularly run-down houses and discovered, to their surprise, that only 5 of these homes had bathtubs, but all 26 had automobiles. The unceasing routine of traveling by streetcar from home to factory and home to the central business district for shopping was replaced by automobile trips to multiple destinations, work, shopping in different neighborhoods, visits to relatives, weekend drives to the country, or evening drives on sultry evenings to escape the heat. The central locus of courtship moved from the parlor or back porch swing to the back seat of the family automobile. The arrival of the automobile in all but the lowest income families created new opportunities, not just for the middle class, but even for working class families. Workers who benefited from paid vacations could now drive hundreds of miles to visit relatives or see attractions. In some areas, new attractions were built specifically for travelers arriving by automobile that were not accessible by transit or railroad. For instance, by 1929, Robert Moses had built the Southern State Parkway on Long Island, which took automobile travelers to Jones Beach with its 6 miles of waterfront and its 23,000 parking spaces for their cars. Before 1920, there was no commerce along the highways between one city or town and the next. Novelist Eudora Welty captured the staccato alternation of open countryside and discreet town borders with nothing in between in Memories of a Childhood Trip, taken in 1917 or 1918. My father would drive sizing up the towns, inspecting the hotel in each, deciding where we could safely spend the night. Towns little or big had beginnings and ends. They reached to an edge and stopped, where the country began again. As though they hadn't happened. They were intact and to themselves. You could see a town lying ahead in its hole, as definitely formed as a plate on a table. Highway construction became a boom industry and changed the nature of highways. No longer were they simply a route to travel from town to town, but they became a location of commerce as entrepreneurs developed new kinds of roadside businesses, from gas stations to automobile dealerships and repair shops to roadside restaurants. People living along American roads began to realize that the waxing throng was really a motorized river of gold flowing past their doors, and they would be wise to try to scoop up some of it. But where could the traveler stay? Hotels were located inside cities, not along the road, and they were too formal. Beginning in the late 1920s, private operators began to provide pay camps equipped with grocery stores and gasoline stations. The precursor of the motel started in the late 1920s, when camp operators began to add tiny cabins. Eventually, the cabins were linked together with a common roof and became the motel. An early example is provided in the classic 1934 movie It Happened One Night, when Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert share a motel room, discreetly draping a blanket on a line to divide the small room into zones of semi-privacy. By the late 1920s, the aesthetic consequences of the highway revolution were becoming apparent. The view from the road, which once had been limited to more or less picturesque countryside, now consisted of a garish and unregulated hodgepodge of brightly painted, hastily erected buildings and tall signs, often electrified. A 1928 description captured the early days of roadside commerce. Every few hundred yards there is a filling station, half a dozen colored pumps before it. In connection with the stations and in between them are huts, carrying the sign "Hot Dogs." Where there is neither hut nor filling station, there are huge hoardings covered with posters. Although the flimsy initial roadside structures were often owned and operated by farmers or businessmen from nearby towns, soon a more ambitious group of entrepreneurs began to put together national networks of roadside outlets. The White Castle hamburger chain began in 1921, when Edgar Ingram and Walter Anderson opened a small restaurant in Wichita, Kansas. Howard Johnson's 1925 drugstore soda fountain in Quincy, Massachusetts, began a chain of roadside restaurants that by 1939 had 132 franchised outlets, and in the 1950s and 1960s had a dominant market position with about 1,000 outlets. Harlan Sanders developed his famous chicken recipe in 1930 at Sanders Service Station in Corbin, Kentucky. J.F. McCullough founded what became Dairy Queen in Kankakee, Illinois in 1938. The victory of the motor vehicle was not without controversy. Government policies encouraged urban sprawl and undermined the financial viability of urban transit and passenger railways. Even before World War II, public policy was skewed in favor of the automobile by building streets and highways with public funds, while leaving urban transit and the interurban electric railways to operate as self-sufficient private companies. Many of the early roads were built by issuing bonds on which the interest was paid by local property taxes. So the automobile owner and transit rider paid equally to build a road system that made the automobile ever more attractive than transit. The spread of residential dispersion and the ubiquity of the automobile gradually eliminated common features of pre-1920 street life. Disappearing from American streets gradually over the years before 1940 and beyond were street vendors, delivery boys, the casual walk, the accidental encounter, the corner drugstore, the local cafe, the neighborhood store, sidewalk displays, and even the sidewalks themselves. Along with these things, a subtle weave of human relations disappeared. Conclusion: a revolution that could happen only once. This and the previous chapter represent the core of the argument in this book. The extent of change created by the modern conveniences to the American home, together with the transportation revolution, made possible by the internal combustion engine, radically improved the standard of living through a series of changes that could happen only once. Together, these inventions fostered a transition from a largely rural to a largely urban society, inherently a change that could happen only once, as the urban percentage could not exceed 100%. This chapter has portrayed the epical change in transportation along at least three dimensions between 1870 and 1940. The first involves the steam-powered intercity railroad, which in 1860 consisted of an ill-coordinated patchwork of lines, almost entirely east of Iowa, that did not provide continuous long-distance travel. In contrast, the typical railroad speeds of 20 to 25 miles per hour in 1870 had nearly tripled by 1940, at least on the premium extra-fare express lines, and railroad travel was continuous across bridges and through underground tunnels. Progress included not just multifold increases in speed, but also multi-dimensional increases in travel comfort, culminating in the near-universal installation of air conditioning in express trains by 1940. The second dimension in intracity transit, which in 1870 consisted entirely of horse-drawn omnibuses traveling at 3 miles per hour and horse-drawn streetcars moving at no more than twice that speed. After the brief rule, at least in a few cities, of the cable car, the electric streetcar arrived as if overnight, and by 1902 had almost completely replaced its horse-drawn predecessors. Soon the largest cities overcame the street congestions of electric streetcars by building extensive elevated and underground electrified rapid transit, and electric interurban trains provided a relatively high-speed alternative to steam railroads for short distances between major cities. As in the case of steam-powered intercity rail, the 1870 to 1940 era witnessed major improvements in transit comfort, as omnibuses bouncing over rutted and unpaved urban streets were replaced with smooth rides along streetcar and rapid transit tracks, and as electricity brought heat and light to transit vehicles. The third and most important dimension is the motor vehicle, which revolutionized city and farm life between 1910 and 1930. Flimsy, expensive, low-powered, uncomfortable automobiles, uncovered and exposed to the elements, were soon replaced by the Model T Ford, which was relatively powerful and sturdy, and which gradually offered its purchasers conveniences, such as covered tops and electric starters. By 1940, automobile bodies were streamlined and enclosed, transmissions and suspensions were greatly improved, and engines were sufficiently powerful to travel at the maximum feasible speed on a newly emerging nationwide network of paved highways. Thanks to Henry Ford's genius in reducing the purchase price of a sturdy, long-lasting motor vehicle to 1/4 or less of annual household income in the 1920s, there was an almost instant transition in just a few years to a new world in which by 1926, fully 93% of farmers in Iowa and other northern states owned their own automobile or motor truck. Banished was rural isolation, replaced by the freedom of farm families in their motor vehicles to roam far and wide in search of the best prices for their produce and the goods they wished to buy, as well as for the recreation and amusements from which they had long been cordoned off by the short traveling radius of the horse-drawn buggy and cart. Taken together, these three separate dimensions of the 1870 to 1940 transportation revolution changed the scale, dimensions, and texture of the city. It was the combination of electricity and automobile that transformed the city. The electric elevator created a vertical complex of office buildings, hotels, and apartment houses in the central business district, with spatial density particularly high in cities such as New York and Chicago that already had well-developed commuter railway networks. But even as the city became more dense in the center, it became less dense in the periphery. In contrast to the city of 1890, with its compact size limited by the range of the horse car and commuter rail lines, The automobile and motor trucks allowed the city of 1940 to spread without concern for lost community. The development of residential suburbs was nothing new. The early railroad suburbs traced their origins back to the 1850s, but these belts of railroad suburbs left large stretches of undeveloped land between the rail lines, and these began to be filled in during the 1920s, not just by residential development, but also by new shopping districts that dispersed retail activity beyond the central business district. The pace of suburbanization was interrupted by the Great Depression and World War II, but began in earnest again in the late 1940s. The three dimensions of transportation improvements had different effects on the most notable aspect of transportation in 1870, its dependence on the horse. Somewhat surprisingly, the steam railroad was not a substitute for the horse, but rather a complement to it. By opening up vast new lands for agriculture, railroads increased the demand for agricultural horses. Though railroads expanded the extent of the national market, their mobility was limited by where their tracks had been laid. Only horses could provide short-distance hauling to and from the railroads, and between points not on the railroads. Horses made the railroads useful in the first place. In contrast, both electrified urban transit, including streetcars and rapid transit trains, were substitutes for the horse, as was the automobile. We have cited counts of street traffic in cities that indicate that horse-drawn vehicles were dominant in 1905, but had largely disappeared by 1917. That short period of transition from urban streets is one of the most rapid in the history of invention. By 1929, horses had largely disappeared from urban America, though the replacement of the horse by farm machinery was not complete until the late 1950s. This chapter on transportation during 1870 to 1940 provides solid evidence for three of the central themes of the book. First, the three dimensions of transportation inventions as classified above unalterably changed the daily life of every member of every family, whether on farms, in small towns, or in cities. Second, most of the benefits to individuals came not within a decade of the initial invention, but over subsequent decades, as subsidiary and complementary sub-inventions and incremental improvements became manifest. Third, taken together, the initial inventions and subsequent complementary improvements could happen only once. The transition of America from a rural to an urban society that occurred between 1870 and 1940 inherently could happen only once. The increase of lapsed intercity train speeds from 25 miles per hour or slower in 1870 to 60 miles per hour or faster in 1940 could happen only once. And after World War II, the transition from piston to jet planes could happen only once. The retirement of horses and their attendant street waste and disease could happen only once. The increased speed of urban public transit within 40 years from 3 to 40 miles per hour could happen only once. The transition of automobiles from flimsy open carriage-like runabouts with engines of 7 horsepower in 1906 to streamlined enclosed cars having 85 to 100 horsepower by 1940 could happen only once. Although many post-war improvements in automobile comfort, convenience, performance, and safety lay ahead beyond 1940. In 1940, most of the future potential of commercial aviation still lay in the future. But the achievements of the great transportation revolution were in place and were complex and multidimensional. The benefits of automobility were overwhelmingly more obvious. An antiseptic city, the end of rural isolation, improved roads, better medical care, consolidated schools, expanded recreational opportunities, and decentralization of business and residential patterns, a suburban real estate boom, and the creation of a standardized middle-class national culture. The year 1940 is a particularly inappropriate place to split this book. Because it neglects the advances in commercial air travel, small and fragmentary in the 1930s by today's standards, but representing the cusp of a post-war revolution that within 18 years of 1940 would produce a single product, the Boeing 707, that traveled at 0.85 of the speed of sound and that bound the world closer together for passenger travel than anything previously invented over centuries and millennia. The passenger transportation revolution was not over in 1940, but, as we shall see in Chapter 11, it was largely over by 1970.
Please subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss another update. Please like, share and comment.